So when it does come to the box, you've got a few bits and bobs on the outside. Obviously the GDDR6 now, but beyond that, the only real difference is obviously it's R now rather than GTX, and they are talking about the ray tracing side of things. The boxes are pretty much identical between the two, and the cards are very, very similar too. Get it in shot, Tom, come on, amateur. So, first things first, we can do the obligatory slow. I really don't care for this slow stuff, so we'll just get it off and throw it away. Anyway, so this is the only way you can tell the difference between them is looking at the top. This is the 2080 Ti, and this one is the 2080. They both have two 8-pin power, as you can see. The heat sinks on them are exactly the same. The card is exactly the same, so it's only the difference between the 2080 Ti and the 2080 that's any different. Things with the Asus that they've added this time, we have a button over here that you can press for the LED, but one of the things that we've been talking about in the office is it'd be kind of nice if, rather than just having this button that you need, why don't you just send it with the lights off and you need the software to turn them on? That would make a bit more sense. The back plate is black. You've still got the same as the Nvidia reference, so you've got USB-C, three display ports and a HDMI all hidden back there. Massive brace that goes right the way around. You'll see it's got the GeForce RTX here, but it doesn't light up or anything. The Strix lighting is on the side here, down the sides as normal, and on the back plate. Back plate looks very similar to last gen. It is thicker than your 2 slots. It's 2.5 slots stroke 3 slots, pretty thick. Masses of heat sink in there. The girth on that is ridiculous, and I'm not going to say that's what she said, so that's what he said. The fans are really the biggest change because they've got the they're enclosed fans now, so the blades have got the circle around the outside as well. I've got to admit though, they do feel a bit flimsy. Now I know the small fans like this never feel particularly strong anyway, but I don't know, I'm going to have to see what these sound like when they're actually running, because obviously you're not going to be poking them when it's in your rig, so it's a bit unfair to say, but massive brace. It's right the way round the other side as well, so we're hoping it will keep the card nice and taut. There is a heatsink plate that's down the bottom as well, which goes over the memory to keep the memory cool. And then if you have a look here, you can see that there's direct contact with the MOSFETs on the main part of the heatsink here. So they've put a lot more time into the actual fin stack on this than they have done with previous generations, I should say. Does feel good and weighty, even though there is a lot of plastic there, but it does keep the weight, so it does feel like a quality thing. And I have to admit, even though there is plastic on it, literally abusing it and throwing it around, that way it doesn't feel particularly flimsy. It's only the fans that I was being really, really picky about. Other thing to kind of pick up with as well is there's a little BIOS switch here. Now if you have it pointing towards the front of the card, that is performance mode. If you have it pointing towards the back of the card, that's quiet mode. So there's a couple of options there that we're going to have to play with when we're testing. But other than that, it does feel and look very Strix. Obviously, we're quite used to the design now, so there are some minor changes, but nothing groundbreaking. Other than the fact, it does feel like one of the 1080 Ti's from before because of the extra girth and weight on the actual card itself. But yeah, it's nothing really major to report. The two 8-pins on both the cards is kind of interesting because some of the other brands are adding on an extra 6-pin and they haven't done with this. So part of me is worried that there's not going to be enough power, but then the other part of me is thinking it's ROG, so maybe it doesn't actually need it. So we will see. Testing will be done as quick as I possibly can do. I've obviously got to get the Nvidia stuff done for NDA tomorrow. I've got a couple of other branded cards due as well, and I've got more stuff due at the end of next week, so I will be going through these cards thick and fast to try and get you the numbers and the information and all the overclocking stuff that are going to be interesting, so please.
So my first slide here is actually the frequencies that all the cards are running at, which is a good way to start before we look at benchmark result numbers. Each card has a boost clock as well as a base clock. Then there's the max frequency that it hit, and then the average frequency that it was running at under load. The RTX 2080 Founders Edition has a base clock of 1515, a boost of 1800. It was actually boosting up to as high as 1980, but while under load over time is running at around 1905. The 2080 Ti Founders Edition has a base of 1350, a boost of 1635, was boosting up to about 1950, but only briefly as it was running at around 1740 megahertz under load. And our first test, 3D Mark Firestrike. This is Ultra Mode in 4K, and here we can see the dominance of the 2080 Ti, and this is going to continue. Spoiler alert, the 2080 Ti wins everything. So I'm going to use that kind of as my 0 point. That's 100% performance right there. And if you compare the other cards here, and I'm really just looking at the graphics score, 2080 Founders Edition is about 20% slower, coming in with a score of 6452, whereas the 1080 Ti was about 9% slower, scoring 7403. Vega 64, unfortunately, coming in last with a score of 5399. That's about 33% slower than the 2080 Ti. Next up is 3D Mark Time Spy. This is a DirectX 12 test. Again, the 2080 Ti Founders Edition coming in with a massive 13,286, the highest score I've ever achieved with a single GPU. 2080 Founders Edition still performing quite well with the score of 10,799. Here it does outperform the Strix GTX 1080 Ti, which might be an indication of the asynchronous compute improved performance. And then finally for synthetics is VR Mark Blue Room, a bit of a virtual reality focused test. Here it actually wants a score over 100 frames per second, and I still haven't achieved that with any GPU, although the 2080 Ti came very close with a score of 98.9 frames per second, and this is actually just about double the score of the GTX 1080 and the Vega 64. Next here is Ashes of the Singularity Escalation DirectX 12 test, and this is running on crazy presets. At 4K here, we have a score of 77.4 frames per second, all the way down the line to the Vega 64 coming in with 44.6 frames per second, 42% behind the score of the 2080 Ti. And then moving over to 2560 by 1440, we can see a similar breakdown when it comes to the overall performance with the 2080 Ti winning again. And since the 2080 Ti is really running away with it here, I think the comparison is going to be between your RTX 2080 Founders Edition, which is $800, and the GTX 1080 Ti, which you can usually get for around $650 to $700. I'm marking this one as $700. So keep an eye on those two as we switch over to 1920 by 1080, 101.7 frames per second for the 2080 Ti, but the 1080 Ti is beating the 2080 Founders Edition here with a score of 90.9 frames per second. And now here's Rise of the Tomb Raider in 4K. This is also DirectX 12. I did not test Shadow of the Tomb Raider for these benchmarks, but I will be testing that in the future. 2080 Ti with a score of 71.8 frames per second. And here the 2080 and the 1080 Ti are pretty much neck and neck with a little over 57 FPS. Here at 2560 by 1440, the 2080 Ti runs away with it once again with a 132.4 frames per second on average, and then the 2080 and 1080 Ti are also battling out at about 107 FPS. Both of these are 19% behind the 2080 Ti, and that 1080, even with its overclock, is just half of the performance of the 2080 Ti, so that's a pretty impressive number there as well. Finally, for 1920 by 1080, 170 FPS for that 2080 Ti, and here we did get some additional performance out of the 1080 Ti, so it was able to beat the 2080 with a score of 164.2 frames per second. And now here's GTA 5. I will continue to run this benchmark as long as it continues to be a popular game that people are playing, which will probably last until GTA 6 comes out. That said, at 4K, 97 frames per second. This is again the best single GPU performance I've seen in this game, especially at 4K, although the 1080 Ti is showing an impressive follow-up with 80 frames per second. Moving over to 2560 by 1440, 157 overall FPS for the 2080 Ti. And then finally with the 1920 by 1080 scores, we can see that we're pretty much CPU limited entirely with the 2080 Ti, 2080, and 1080 Ti scoring 164 FPS, and then just a little bit of fall off for the 1080, while the Vega 64 comes in with a respectable 128 FPS, but still 22% behind the performance of the 2080 Ti Founders Edition. Here's Total War Warhammer 2. We're running the campaign benchmark in the Ultra preset, and at 3840 by 2160, again, 2080 Ti wins with 69 frames per second. 1080 Ti and 2080 are pretty much neck and neck here as well. Although if we move over to 2560 by 1440, the 2080 Founders Edition gains a little bit of a lead with a 92 frames per second score versus 84 FPS from the 1080 Ti. Finally, for 1920 by 1080, we're once again hitting some CPU limitations, so we're scoring about 120 frames per second for the highest end end cards, although we do still have a drop for the 1080 and the poor Vega 64 coming in with a 40% lower score than the 2080 Ti in this test. But that's okay because it does a little bit better in Battlefield 1. This is Battlefield 1 at 4K, DirectX 11 mode. 2080 Ti comes in with over 100 frames per second. The Vega 64 is at least able to beat the GTX 1080 in this test with a score of 61 FPS versus 56. At 2560 by 1440, we have a very impressive 171 FPS by the 2080 Ti. So for those of you looking at 1440 high refresh rate monitors, I think this might be a good choice for you if you have the money, of course. And even that 2080 Founders Edition coming in with 138 FPS here. But if we move over to 1920 by 1080, we're again a little bit CPU limited, scoring around 190 frames per second for the 1080 Ti, and 2080 Ti drops off a little bit with the 2080, and then the For the Win 2 1080 coming in with 144 frames per second. And finally, here's Overwatch for running with Epic settings. So at 4K, that actually is pretty challenging for a lot of GPUs. We can see the Vega 64 only managing 71 frames per second here. That is 43% behind the 2080 Ti, which comes in with 125 frames per second. And here again, the 1080 Ti is pulling its weight with a score of 111 frames per second, handily beating out the 2080 Founders Edition. If we move to 2560 by 1440, we can see some very impressive high frame rates. So again, for those of you guys who are looking at higher refresh rate monitors, that is part of the reason why I included these lower resolution benchmarks, including 1920 by 1080. But 231 frames per second from the 2080 Ti. Again, best single GPU performance that I have seen in this test. And finally, here's your 1920 by 1080 results. We are hitting the actual frame limit for the game itself, 300 FPS with the 2080 Ti and the 1080 Ti. We're actually bumping into the game's frame limit, which is 300 FPS for this. So with the 2080 Ti and the 1080 Ti, we're pretty much right up against that. Drop back a little bit for the 2080 Founders Edition with 262 FPS, and the 1080 come in with 224. Finally, here are some power draw numbers for you. It was measured at peak as well as on average during the 3D Mark Firestrike Ultra combined test. I'd say the most impressive thing here is that the 2080 Ti Founders Edition has a lower average power draw than the 1080 Ti, while also sporting that much improved performance as you've seen with the tests we've just gone over. 2080 Founders Edition is drawing a bit more than the 1080 For the Win 2, so maybe a little bit of a drop off in efficiency there, but still definitely not bad at all, especially when you compare it to the Vega 64, which was drawing 470 on average with a peak of over 550 watts. As for temperatures, these are just the peak temperatures I saw during my standard testing. 2080 Founders Edition peaked at 78 Celsius. The 2080 Ti Founders Edition peaked at 80. I'm going to do a little bit more expansive temperature testing with overclocking taken into account as well when I do my overclocking video, which is going to be coming up very soon. So don't forget to subscribe if you haven't already for that one. But that's pretty much it for the numbers I've gathered for you guys. Actually, I take that back. I have a few more numbers for you guys because I wanted to sort of gather all of this stuff up into a ball and sculpt it into some form of addressable, easily digestible information for you guys. So I took all the scores from every single test that I ran and I gathered them together to create some averages so we can compare the performance as well as the price to performance. Let's look just at performance first of all. If you consider the 1080 to be your baseline, so that's like your 100% performance mark, across all of my tests, the Vega 64 was 10% lower, which is kind of sad. So we're looking forward to AMD's new stuff, which hopefully will be coming in Q4. 1080 Ti is 31% faster than the 1080. The 2080 Founders Edition is 25% faster, so it did come in a little bit slower overall than the 1080 Ti. And then the 2080 Ti Founders Edition was 50% faster. So going from 1080 to 2080, about a 25% performance increase. That's not too bad. That's actually what we would expect, maybe a little bit more than you'd expect going from generation to generation, or maybe a little bit less than you'd expect considering that it's been 2 years since the last generation. If we use the 1080 Ti though as our baseline, that's your 100% mark for performance. The Vega 64 is 69% of that. The 1080 is 76% of that. The 2080 Founders Edition is 95% of that, so 5% slower. And the 2080 Ti Founders Edition is 114% as fast, so 14% improvement.